Good afternoon. My name is Elżbieta Grodek, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of French. On behalf of McMaster Alumni Association, I welcome you to today's talk about the curious history of the world's first encyclopedia. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Myron Groover, who is Archives and Rare Books Librarian at McMaster University and a lecturer in the Department of History. Myron holds a master's degree from the University of Aberdeen, as well as a Master of Library and Information Studies and a Master of Archival Studies degrees from the University of British Columbia. Over the last 6 years, Myron and I have embarked on several teaching collaborations. The most recent took place within a course Image and Knowledge Dissemination offered by the Department of French. During this course, we discussed Diderot's Encyclopedia and its illustrations as vehicles of knowledge. In his generosity, Myron told me that it was this course and an enthusiastic participation of students that made him think about disseminating this knowledge further in the public lecture. I wish everyone a wonderful travel across the pages of Diderot's Encyclopédie. Our knowledgeable guide will be Myron Groover.
Thank you, Dr. Grodek, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to McMaster alumni and my colleagues in the William Reedy Division of Archives and Research Collections for putting together this series. As Dr. Grodek said, I'm here to talk about the world's first encyclopedia. And I'm an enthusiastic user of footnotes even in my slides, so you will notice that when I say it's the first encyclopedia, terms and conditions may apply. And we'll get to what that means in a moment. Welcome. Thank you for being here with me in this virtual space. Welcome to my bibliocave beneath the stairs. And today we'll be traveling backwards in time. So we're going to begin with an overview of what we'll talk about today. We're going to start by talking about the origins of the concept of the encyclopedia, which are a little bit more curious than you might expect. We're going to talk about historical works which directly and sometimes indirectly influenced the Encyclopédie of Diderot. And then we're going to talk about the Encyclopédie itself. We'll speak about its contributors, the intellectual and political climate which shaped it and informed it. We'll talk about the technical challenges and labor associated with its production. And we will talk about the various sordid events, backstabbings, betrayals, unhappinesses, and miseries which actually conditioned this project and caused Diderot to eventually almost recant having worked on it. So a really positive and uplifting message today. It might make sense to start talking about what came before the Encyclopédie of Diderot, what came before any encyclopedia, in fact. So we'll talk about proto-encyclopedic works, pseudo-encyclopedists, so writers of encyclopedic style works, and other curiosities in this vein. Now, the idea of a comprehensive book of knowledge, so either a miscellany or a very deliberate effort to disseminate a complete view of a subject or of all subjects, this is not something that's confined to the early modern period or the 18th century. This actually has a very, very long history. I have a bit of a sideline as a quasi-classicist, so these entries are informed by that background, but there are many more. Varro in the 1st century BC wrote 9 books of disciplines, a lost work. Most of his works are lost, actually. We know of it only through references in other sources, which was supposed to be a sort of a comprehensive conceptual map of the Roman mental world. Pliny the Elder, famously in the 1st century AD, wrote his Natural History. which was a sort of gazetteer of the entire world. Capella in the 5th century wrote this kind of wonderfully, bizarrely named text, the Marriage of Mercury and Philology, which was again a sort of survey work looking at the intellectual firmament of late antiquity. Vincent de Beauvais in the 13th century wrote the Speculum Maius, which is the Greater Mirror, which was another wide-ranging work. And perhaps most famously, and a very direct influence on Diderot, was Francis Bacon's planned but never written work, the Instauratio Magna, which was his planned. It was supposed to be multiple volumes. The idea was to have a deliberately mapped out system for communicating the totality of world knowledge. Quite an ambitious remit, so it's perhaps not such a surprise that he copped out and never finished it. Kidding, he was very prolific. He just never got around to doing it. But he wrote a very detailed prospectus, a very detailed plan for this text, and that prospectus, that detailed plan, ended up being a big influence on the later, more recognizable encyclopedists. Now we're going to do one of my favorite things and talk about etymology, which is something that I love to talk about. We'll talk about the word encyclopedia itself. I find it hilarious that the word encyclopedia is not actually a real word. The only reason we have it as a word is because of apparently a single incidence of scribal error in the 15th century. It comes from a Greek term, encyclopædia, which is like general education. Encyclios means circular, all-encompassing, engirdling in a sense, and paideia means education, especially of children. Some copyists who are copying a work by Quintilian called the Institutio Oratio, which is this like multi-volume text about how to speak in public, they mash these two Greek words together by accident. This is an incorrect copy, and a Neo-Latin word is born as a result, Encyclopedia. So we have a word, but we don't necessarily have a concept to go with it yet. It's kind of interesting because we have a new word that no one knows what it means, but people start using it almost immediately. So within decades of this scribal error, this word has entered the Neo-Latin lexicon. Latin at this time is the primary medium of scholarly exchange in Latin Western Europe. And people start using the word almost immediately, even though it doesn't have a meaning yet. At first, no one really knows what this says. We have records of early writers early in the 16th century describing other people's works as encyclopedic, which seems to connote that these are masterpieces or particularly strong foundationally. And by the early 1500s, actually quite quickly after the copy era, people are writing books that they're calling encyclopediae. But the word really doesn't have a fixed form yet. So these texts vary extremely widely in their articulation. Here's an example. This would be the first that I know of text that's written with the word encyclopedia in the title. A rough translation from the Latin would be in the encyclopedia, or knowledge of the world's disciplines, both sacred and profane. That is to say, the theses of the mystical philosophers. He continues a whole page. This was by depending who you ask, either a German or a Croatian philologist and theologian named Paul Scalich. It's famous for being the first work to use the word encyclopedia, but it's also sort of regarded as kind of a terrible book. It's poorly written. The Latin's not that great. People don't really like it. It doesn't do what it says on the tin, right? You get this super overblown and ambitious title, and then the book itself is really kind of thin on the ground. But it is significant for the first use of the term to describe a published work. But the first, I guess, recognizably modern encyclopedist is not actually Diderot, but it's a guy named Ephraim Chambers, who was active in the United Kingdom in the late 17th and early 18th century. And this fellow lived kind of an interesting life. He was apprenticed to a globe maker, and so he was in a very literally and metaphorically worldly profession. It's his business to sort of study the entire world. from a geographical standpoint. And while apprenticed as a globe maker, he has this idea of writing a comprehensive but a really aggressively distilled survey of all of the world's useful knowledge. This really is the cornerstone work of his career as a writer. He works on it for the rest of his life. This is a depressingly recurrent theme with masterpieces. They often consume the people that contribute to them. And so what does he call this work? He's trying to come up with a title that's going to encompass the efforts. Well, he calls it, yeah. So remember when I said early modern titles and that footnote back there were not particularly snappy? They got a lot worse before they got better. The 18th century is sort of the most excessive century for book titles. They can run to even hundreds of words. This one's actually comparatively modest. But the idea was that this was a universal dictionary of arts and sciences. It was supposed to contain sort of all useful knowledge, but in a really, really distilled and abstract form. And this is an important work for a number of reasons, not just because it's the first recognizable attempt to write a book that's called an encyclopedia, that is encyclopedic in the sense that we would think of it today, but also because it became a direct influence on the book that we're going to be talking about today. So now we're going to look at what happened after this sort of proto-encyclopedic period and look at the actual French Enlightenment and the context in which the Encyclopédie came to be. Ironically, the Encyclopédie of Diderot did not start out as an attempt to write an original work at all. It actually started off as a translation project. So there was a publisher by the name of André Le Breton who hired a couple of foreigners, John Mills from the UK and Gottfried Celius. Wait, UK, yes, it's post-1707. I had to catch myself there. It was the UK by then. And Gottfried Celius, who was a German. He hires these two guys to translate Chambers' Encyclopedia into French. It doesn't go great. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it does not go particularly well. In fact, the project sort of implodes when the publisher, André Le Breton, ends up basically pulling the rug out from under the project and swindles the translators out of all of their money. So all of the subscription money that had been used to fund the production of the volume, he kept it for himself. He said it was because their French wasn't good enough and they weren't French enough to work on this project. One of the authors took issue with this, and it said that Le Breton physically assaulted him in the street and beat him for this affront. So he swindles the guy. Then when the guy says, "This isn't really fair, I want my money," Breton attacks him in the street. A sympathetic court says, "Oh yeah, no harm, no foul. You're fine there, bud. Don't worry about it." And so bear this in mind because Le Breton will appear several times in this narrative. Diderot, meanwhile, has apparently been working behind the scenes on this translation. So he's been enlisted to shore up this translation. The project collapses, but Diderot knows that they're on to a good thing, and he's very, very interested in this. And so how do we get from this translation project to the Encyclopédie itself? Well, Le Breton is persuaded by Diderot and others to publish an entirely new work. And the idea here was to consolidate the ideas and knowledge from the French Republic of Letters. This is a century of tremendous intellectual productivity, of innovation, of rapid advancement in several areas, and we'll touch on that Enlightenment context a little bit later. The publisher somehow managed to scrounge up money for what was clear from the outset was going to be a much bigger enterprise than a simple translation of a work from another language. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, was persuaded fairly early on to become a colleague and co-editor of the volume. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. And permission is initially secured from the government to start working on the project. Now, this is important, and it seems a little strange to contemporary minds, but at this point, publishing and printing in many, many parts of Europe are actually a matter of a royal and to a lesser extent, ecclesiastical prerogative. You can't just write whatever you want. You can't just publish whatever you want. It needs to be cleared with the authorities ahead of time, and that's why many, many early modern and 18th century books will open with a formula, the same formula, but in different languages of saying, written avec le privilège et approbation du roi in French, or in Italian and other languages, it'll be some variant on that theme, with the privilege or with the permission of the king. So they do manage to secure permission to move forward with the project. They publish an elaborate prospectus, kind of like Francis Bacon's idea for his proto-encyclopedia. They publish this elaborate plan for the work, and the first volume comes out in 1751. The scope of the encyclopedia was massive. They are combining esoteric philosophical ideas with really practical knowledge about trades, manufacturing, industry. So in that sense, this really is a very, very comprehensive work. And the image we see here on this slide is a sort of visual diagram of the plan for the way that knowledge was organized in the Encyclopédie. The idea was that everyone in society would benefit from having access essentially to the sum of the world's knowledge all in one place. So at this point, it might make sense to talk a little bit about the editors and contributors. So there were two main editors of this project, Denis Diderot, who was, it feels crude to say that he was a philosopher and art critic. He was one of the signal minds of the French Enlightenment, a direct contemporary of Rousseau and Voltaire. His reputation, I think, has held up well and has actually improved over time. He was constantly in trouble with the authorities. He was refused burial in the Pantheon on several occasions until the question became moot because he had profound anti-establishment tendencies, or was held to. And the co-editor, the sort of lesser of the two editors, was Jean-Baptiste Laurent d'Alembert, who was chiefly a mathematician, but also a natural philosopher, a musician, a music critic, who was eventually buried in an unmarked grave for reasons of atheism. So people's philosophical choices could carry real consequences at this time. But these aren't the only two people to work on the volume. Over 150 people end up contributing, including Rousseau himself and other philosophes, the luminaries of the philosophe movement. But in a manner I think familiar to many of us who take on editorial work, Diderot ends up writing over 7,000 of the articles himself. D'Alembert writes several. He stops writing at a certain point for reasons that we'll get into. So the editors really end up at a certain point taking on a huge amount of ownership of the text. And there are some really sophisticated and impressive efforts going on now to map all the contributors, to sort of analyze the prose style of the entries and attribute them correctly. And I find that really, really fascinating work. But the question then is, why are they doing this now? You know, I've said the word Enlightenment a few times, and I've talked about these guys, let's say, countercultural tendencies to some degree. Why is this possible now? Why has a work like this never been done before? Well, first, we're going to do the hype and sort of do the party line on the French Enlightenment. This is a time period that is informed by burgeoning currents of rationalism, so the idea that the human mind is supreme and can think through all problems, concepts of skepticism, so not trusting things by rote, but applying analytical and observational approaches to sort of pick apart the threads of the world to see how they connect. There's a growing emphasis on empiricism, on physical observation of phenomena as a way of informing the intellect. And there is a real, almost a mania for taxonomy at this point. Taxonomy, of course, is the science of categorizing and organizing phenomena. At this time period, this is driven a lot by the advances that are taking place in botany and other natural sciences, so the classification of plants, animals, things of that nature. this is building on a kind of slow-moving momentum of categorizing the world that's one of the hallmarks of the early modern period. But in the 18th century, various technical and philosophical advancements really make this take off. At the same time, you're seeing a lot of advances in political and ethical theory in France, in science and mathematics, not just in France, but all over the world. You're seeing advances in aesthetics, also in engineering and in the technology for producing books. You're seeing the first sort of conceptions of comparative religion, which may not seem as interesting to our modern minds as it should. I mean, bear in mind that the wars of religion have devastated the European continent for centuries at this point. And the idea that religions can be rationally and objectively compared to one another based on their merits, or that questions that they answer for people is very, very new. We'll talk about a work in that vein here in a moment. And there's also a sort of a cultural ferment in France, in particular, of salons, literary circles, societal influence peddling, secret organizations, public organizations, quasi-private organizations dedicated to letters and the promulgation of knowledge. And there's a general aesthetic of subversion that's becoming quite fashionable in certain circles of the French intelligentsia. And all of these factors contribute to the French Enlightenment. So we talk for just a moment about a proto-Enlightenment text. This is from the very early 18th century. This is, in fact, the world's first work of comparative religion. It's often referred to simply as the Picard after its engraver. It's called the Cérémonies et Coutumes Religieuses de tous les peuples du monde. And this is almost a proto-encyclopedic work in its own right. It is a multi-volume, 10-plus volume work that aims to exhaustively profile in an almost ethnographic sense all of the world's religions, their major merits. It was a tremendously expensive work to produce, so very few people could afford it. What we're looking at here on the right-hand side is a fold-out copper plate engraving depicting the papal coronation ceremony or procession. My colleagues and I love looking at this particular engraving because it's got all these great captions. There's one cluster of guys in there who are labeled the Pope's hat carriers, and they're all carrying Pope crowns on sticks. Not sure what that's all about, but apparently a very important part of the coronation procession. So on one hand, you have a sort of burgeoning, what we'll call an Enlightenment sentiment, but on the other hand, there are material realities of French and European society at this time that are extremely unpleasant, that are conditioning but also countervailing these sort of Enlightenment impulses. In France in particular, the monarchy is fairly repressive and censorious, is also very beholden to ecclesiastical authorities in certain senses. France has been riven by centuries of religious violence and intercommunity conflict. The book we were talking about a minute ago was actually published in Amsterdam by Protestant emigres from France who couldn't actually publish in France. France is embroiled in an endless procession of sordid, bloody, grotesque colonial wars, which they're beginning to develop a marked penchant for losing badly, which is contributing to a certain sense of international humiliation. There's very limited class mobility, very limited social mobility, endemic rampant poverty, and grotesque exploitation of human capital and natural resources, both at home and abroad. So when we say the siècle des Lumières, we have to kind of, it's almost an ironic phrase. There's a lot of things all happening at the same time. They're not all positive and they're not all enlightened by any means. In spite of that, and the fact that it's complicated, I would say that the Encyclopédistes, the contributors to the project, they're essentially optimistic about the potential that the world could change for the better. D'Alembert himself described the 18th century as the century of philosophy par excellence, because of exactly the progress that we discussed that's being made in this time period, and also because of a contemporary expectation that philosophy, its purpose is to dramatically improve human life, and that if only we invest enough in being philosophically correct and promulgating knowledge, this will naturally elevate the human condition and the human mind, which is quite a rosy idea. So now we finally get to talk about the Encyclopédie itself. This was really a revolutionary work. And when you say revolutionary in France, you're like, oh, okay, the revolution, small r or big R. It's a bit of both, actually. The entries of the Encyclopédie tend to be often profoundly materialistic in spirit, which is, to say it's a bit of a faux pas, an understatement. We'll talk about that more in a moment. They tend to be very, very philosophically sophisticated. Diderot is best remembered as a philosopher. In fact, he was a tremendously sophisticated thinker and a very gifted writer. They tend to be skeptical of organized religion. This is really something that almost becomes a fatal flaw for the project. And depending who is complaining on any given day, the authors are accused of being atheistic or even pagan in their sympathies. So we're going to look now at an example of an entry from the Encyclopédie. And this is one that was singled out for a great deal of opprobrium, and this came out in the very first volume. This is the entry for autophagie, or cannibalism, sort of a grotesque subject. The translation on the right is mine, so forgive me if it's poor. Some authors trace the origin of this barbaric custom to the flood. They claim that the giants were the first cannibals. And now, if we look at the text in bold here, the author is saying, it seems to me that cannibalism was not the vice of a country or a nation, but that of a century. Before men had been softened by the birth of the arts and civilized by the imposition of laws, it appears that most peoples ate human flesh. Right, so this is a very, very offensive concept. The idea that people were once in such a primitive state that they routinely consumed one another's flesh. This is significant in itself, actually, because a sideline of Diderot's was advancing almost proto-Darwinian ideas about the way organisms develop. This was something that got him in a lot of trouble. And I think we can see a glimmering of that idea in this phrase here. And then he goes on to lampoon the medical establishment by saying that some doctors have ridiculously imagined that they have discovered the principle of cannibalism in an acrid bilious humor, which is lodged in the membranes of the heart and produced by the irritation this causes. They claim to observe this horrible veracity among several of the ill and use these observations to support their feelings. One author has questioned whether cannibalism is contrary to or conforms to nature. So not only is cannibalism a protean form of the human condition, it might actually be natural for people to eat one another. This is like outrageous stuff here. This is in the very first volume. So probably not a surprise that the project starts running into trouble pretty early on. Before we get into the problems that the project ran into, let's talk about just some of the technical challenges that were involved in producing this volume. It's a hugely complex undertaking. Over a period of about 15 years, 18 core volumes are published. They contain the entries. These are all typeset and printed by hand. The labor that informs these processes is substantially more manual than we would even be able to imagine today. The volumes are accompanied by 11 companion works, which have illustrations. Now, the reason the illustrations aren't in the main body of the text is that it just would have cost way too much. Illustrations produced from engravings are done on a different type of press than text is. And so producing editions that contain both engravings and text is very, very expensive. And on a project of this scale, would have bankrupted every publisher in France, essentially. So the illustrations are in a separate set of volumes. So you look at the entry and then you check another volume to see the illustration. All in all, the original run ends up with almost 72,000 articles and over 3,000 illustrations. All of this is original work. Copperplate engravings in particular are incredibly time-consuming to do. And I think it is correctly regarded as among the signal achievements of French letters. It's almost a stereotypically foundational Enlightenment text. If you ask people to name one Enlightenment book, this might be at the top of many people's lists. And McMaster is very fortunate to possess a complete first edition of this text, which of course is not here with me at home, but which when we return to a more normal world, people will become able to come in and access anytime they like. A shameless plug for my division is that we are proudly open to the public. So we got this amazing Enlightenment period, and we have this incredible text that's being produced. And the authors are kind of taking all these risque moves and offending the establishment, and everything's going great. Maybe not. After the project concludes, Diderot actually announces that he regrets being involved with it at all. This is what is, considered by most people to be his greatest achievement of his lifetime. He tells people it was a waste of 25 years of his life and he wished he'd never been involved. Like, why is that? How do you get from this sort of amazingly sophisticated, subversive, incisive, clever text to its chief contributor basically saying it was a waste of time? I can't believe I was swindled into doing this. Well, Diderot was in trouble with the law even before the Encyclopedia project really took off. I think that's actually an erroneous date, should be 1748. He was jailed at Vincennes because he had this habit of writing literature that was subversive and scandalous, not to our standards, but the standards of the day. And he would do this thing where he would publish it anonymously, so he wouldn't put his name on it, so that the authorities couldn't pin it to him. And he was sort of being a little bit creative with how he was approaching royal privilege and printing things. And he actually becomes subjected to intense police surveillance in the 1740s. And spends some time in jail, gets out of jail. He's working on the Encyclopédie project, and that runs into legal trouble as well, almost instantly. Here is a letter from, in the name of the King of France, although of course this was written by some sniveling under-minister of some kind. This is a condemnation of the first two. So they've only produced 2 volumes, and this letter comes out of the royal apparatus. And I'll read it out because it's kind of a great exercise in 18th century pompous language. The king, having been informed of what happened concerning the Encyclopedia, His Majesty recognizes that in these 2 volumes, it has been effected to insert several maxims tending to destroy royal authority, establish a spirit of independence and revolt, and under obscure and equivocal terms to elevate the foundations of error, corruption of morals, irreligion, and incredulity. He goes on at some length, and then he says, the book's going to be suppressed. He very expressly inhibits and prohibits all printers, booksellers, and others from reprinting or having reprinted the said 2 volumes, or also to sell, debit, or otherwise distribute the printed copies which remain to them on penalty of £1,000 fine, and if such other penalties are appropriate, even as far as printers and booksellers are concerned, on pain of forfeiture and deprivation of control of their shops. So this is like pretty nuclear level state repression that comes down the pipe after 2 volumes. Remember, there's 18 in title, and by volume 2, they've already infuriated the monarchy. Diderot does manage to convince, with the help of several illustrious backers, he does manage to convince the royal apparatus to permit the text to continue to be written. This is at tremendous personal and political cost to Diderot. This burns a lot of friendships for him. He expends a lot of personal credibility on this, and he ends up writing more and more of the entries himself as time goes on. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he was consumed by this work while he was working on it. He's sort of also reverting to all of these subversive strategies for like skirting the degree to which he's enraging the monarchy. So like from the 7th volume onwards, he not erroneously, he's doing it on purpose. He alters the title pages to imply that they were printed in Neuchâtel, which today is in Switzerland, but at this time was an independent principality. So he was telling people that he'd printed it just over the border, out of the clutches of the French king. It was a total lie. It was being it was completely being printed in Paris the whole time. This might seem like a really obvious subterfuge to us, but at the time, this was like a pretty clever trick. But it wasn't enough. It didn't work. The authorities consider this to be an act of war as soon as it starts being published. This quote is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which has a wonderful entry on Diderot that I would encourage anyone to read, as a matter of fact. A lot of these sort of arguments with the authorities might seem kind of esoteric to us today if we don't have intense backgrounds in theology, which who does anymore? But he would get in trouble for things like he hacked off the clergy in Geneva, which at this time is, like militantly Calvinist jurisdiction. An Encyclopédie article implies that the religious learned heads of Geneva are not actually Calvinist enough, that they've fallen into doctrinal error. That was an entry written by D'Alembert, and the pressure that comes down on him is so heavy that as a result, he basically retires from the project. He's like, whoa, this is too hot for me, man. I got to get out. Like I'm irritating the clergy. Like I'm going to get disappeared. Something bad's going to happen to me. And so he kind of contributes a few technical entries after that, but they're mostly around mathematics, which is held to be safe from philosophical opprobrium. The royal apparatus actually revokes their privilege, their right to publish in 1759, but they do manage to keep publishing it because of various influential backers. But the sort of the final blow and the ultimate cosmic betrayal is realized in 1764, 1 year prior to the publication of the last volume. He discovers that Le Breton, the publisher, remember the guy that beat the guy up for doing a bad job on a translation and stole all his money? Not only has Le Breton been altering his entries, so unbeknownst to him, his editor is actually altering his writing in the final published form of the text. Not only has he been doing this, he's actually been setting fire to Diderot's manuscripts so that the original text can never be recovered. And this obviously leads to a sense of profound betrayal. Not only have you published things under your name that have been altered by somebody else who's not necessarily 100% ideologically sympathetic to what you're trying to say, not only that, but this person in whom you've reposed some degree of trust has also actually been literally torching your manuscripts so that you lose in perpetuity all of that work. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Encyclopédie persists in the popular imagination today, but I would invite you all to consider what could have been, what might have been, what would the Encyclopédie have been like in a world where royal censorship was less oppressive, or where they pissed fewer people off, or where even the text that the authors wanted made it into the final volumes. I've been thinking about this myself, and the conclusion I think that I've ultimately come to is that you can't actually divorce the Encyclopédie from its historical context. In considering what might have been, this is substantially an exercise in fantasy. It is exactly the repressive and censorious impulses of royal and ecclesiastical authorities and societal conservative figures that provide the kind of spark of anger that animates the project in the first place. So I don't know that you can necessarily take any of these components away and end up with the Encyclopédie that we have, but it is entertaining to consider what might have been in a perfect universe. That is the content of my talk for you all today. Thank you for joining me. I really, really enjoyed working on this presentation. It's one of my favorite books. It's a great story. One of the things I love about it is, when I first came to this text, it was as a sort of a young, impressionable history student whose mind was crammed full of glorious visions of the French Enlightenment and the siècle des Lumières and the sort of amazing cultural and artistic attainments of the time period. And then when you start sort of digging below the surface, you just find this sort of grotesque web of betrayals and controversies and broken interpersonal relationships. And remember that both of the chief editors were subjected even to posthumous insult and ignominy. D'Alembert couldn't even be buried in consecrated ground. So there's a marked difference between our perception of this work and the material reality that was lived by its contributors and contemporaries. That's all I have, and at this point I'm pleased to throw open the floor to any questions from the audience that we might have.
Okay, so thank you to Myron for this exciting look at a rare and important set of books, and also to Dr. Grodek for introducing this talk. My name is Jillian Dunks. I am Archives Arrangement and Description Librarian in the William Reedy Division of Archives and Research Collections. I'm one of the organizers of the Archives Alive series, which is a partner on today's talk. And today I will be moderating the Q&A session with Myron. So if you have any questions that you would like Myron to answer, please put them into the chat. Bridget Whittle, who is the Digital Archives Librarian in our division, and also a previous lecturer in this series, is monitoring the chat. And she is also willing to answer questions too. So one of the first questions that we often get at this type of event, and something that was submitted in advance, was how does McMaster acquire rare books like this? Myron, would you tell us a little more about that?
Absolutely. So rare books, this is a very good question. There's a reason that people always ask it. As an aside, when I started doing presentations like this, I found it really interesting how many people sort of immediately wanted to get behind the scenes and think about the material circumstances of rare book libraries and how we actually acquire things. It wouldn't have necessarily occurred to me that that would be something that would be of interest to the general public, but it always is. So I'm really happy to talk about it. I would say that rare books for us chiefly come in one of two ways. Often we receive rare books as gifts, so donations from alumni or bibliophiles. The interesting thing about a rare book library is that it's kind of like a snowball. It starts small, but it gathers momentum as time goes on. And the more momentum a rare book library gathers, and the stronger it becomes in certain collecting areas, the more prone collectors are going to be to take notice and say, you know what, McMaster has very, very strong holdings in this certain area that's very interesting to me. I want my books to go there. So that they'll be with other works of the same kind and so that they'll be more likely to be used. And it so happens that one of McMaster's particular collecting strengths is the 18th century, not just in English, but in French. So we have probably around 18 to 20,000 volumes just from the 18th century in our collection. So this is a major collecting area for us, and that is a sort of incentive to donors who might be thinking of the legacy of their own collections. And so some things come in as gifts. Sometimes those will be single items, and sometimes we'll acquire a collector's entire library if it's of sufficient merit and interest and relevance. The other way that we develop the collection is through purchases. So I receive a certain amount of money every year, and there are also various trusts in the library which support the development of the collection. And so a major component of my role is keeping an eye on the rare book market, seeing what sorts of things are coming up for sale, what things are at good value, what things are at good condition, and what things are germane to the strengths of our collection or the interests of people on campus. And so I'm actually going out and proactively purchasing selected items from time to time. So we just did a whole whack of fairly significant new acquisitions just this month. So this is a collection that continues to grow both through gifts and purchases, and developing it is one of the parts of my job that I enjoy the most.
Thanks, Myron. We have a lot of questions that have been submitted, which is great. So the first one that I'll ask is about Diderot's experience of political censorship in this project. Was this characteristic of the age? And did other authors and editors receive similar treatments?
Absolutely, yeah. This was by no means an exceptional set of circumstances. It was just a very high profile one in a book that became extremely famous, and so was something that people talked about a lot. Navigating royal prerogative and privilege was a fixture of French intellectual life in the 18th century and even before that, and not just in France either. One of the really interesting things about watching the way that the book production and the book trade evolves in Europe during the early modern era is kind of clocking how much of the innovation and geographical distribution of book production is conditioned directly by people's attempts to evade censorship, political persecution, religious persecution. For example, Antwerp and the Low Countries, Amsterdam as well, become major centers of book production in French, often exactly because they're not technically in a French dominion at a given time. And so authors, the Picard that we talked about, that work of comparative religion is another example. They set up shop in Amsterdam because they were facing religious and political persecution in France. This is not a dynamic that's confined to France and the Low Countries, although there's something interesting to consider here in the kind of atomization of political power as well. In France, it's a royal prerogative. In Italy, which is not unified, you have a lot more options. You might be able to go kind of like one principality over and get permission to publish something that you wouldn't have been able to get published in your home jurisdiction. And authors and publishers would actually kind of game these dynamics. They'd be like, okay, this king or this prince or this whatever doesn't like this subject matter, and he's got a really intense rivalry with this other guy who's going to push back against anything he tries to do. So why don't I try and go to that guy's jurisdiction and offer to dedicate the work to him as a kind of a conspicuous stick in the eye to the person who would have reigned over me in my home jurisdiction. So yes, absolute fixture of intellectual life of the period. There were various creative ways of getting around it to an extent, but censorship and controversy tended to catch up with people eventually.
Thank you. So we also have a couple of questions about Wikipedia, actually. So I'll try to condense, connections between the set of volumes that we're talking about in that. How do you think future archivists and librarians might reflect on our modern experience of building Wikipedia in comparison? And I'll add to, of course, lots of people contribute to Wikipedia,
Yeah.
not librarians. Yes.
I'm a little biased here, I'll admit. I think that if there are any historians left to write the history of our age, Wikipedia will be regarded as one of the signal achievements of humankind in our era. I'm not exaggerating at all. I think that in 100 or 200 years, someone very much like myself will give a talk very much like this one, talking about the promise and pitfalls of Wikipedia as a collaborative effort. It is the encyclopédie of our age. The question of how librarians and archivists are going to preserve that content is a little bit more challenging. Wikipedia, of course, is it's a type of artifact that archivists refer to as being born digital. That is to say, it is a work that is never intended to live on any medium other than as a bit stream. As my colleagues who are also participating in this presentation know, there are some real challenges associated with the preservation of digital text. It's not a problem that's been solved yet, but it is something that we're making more progress toward. The other issue is that compared to the Encyclopédie, Wikipedia would be orders of magnitude larger than the Encyclopédie. Like, we could look at the Encyclopédie on the shelf and be like, whoa, it's massive. You know, it takes up 3 or 4 meters of shelf space just for the core volumes, let alone the illustrations. If you were to print Wikipedia, you wouldn't even be able to fit it in our library, the whole library. So we're dealing with an order of magnitude more text, and then we have digitalist images and navigational components associated with that we would also need to preserve. So I don't mean this to sound like a cop-out, but it is much easier to preserve physical volumes that do not require electronic mediation to be read. A physical volume is something that the eye can directly perceive. So as long as you don't lose the ability to navigate the language, as long as the physical material lasts, humans can interact directly with the text. That's much more challenging in a digital environment.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. There are a few here about the readership of the Encyclopedia. So who were these people, or who was the intended readership?
Well, the irony, while this is sort of intended to be, oh, it's a lofty project and this is going to pull, every man up by his bootstraps and whatever. I mean, the reality is that these are like folio-sized volumes. They're super expensive to produce. And that means that they can only really be afforded by wealthy individuals. The Picard, that early modern comparative religion book we talked about, was sort of in the same vein. Anything that was as expensive to produce as the Encyclopédie, this isn't like some cheap little pamphlet. These are massive books. I wish I'd included a slide of me holding one of them. Like a volume of the Encyclopédie is the size of my entire torso. So these are very expensive to make. Because they're expensive to make, they're expensive to buy. So they tend to be acquired by wealthy individuals with either intellectual sympathies or pretensions. So this is not like a work of mass readership, although the authors and contributors might have liked it to be. The material constraints of producing the volume really would have restricted who would have had access to it.
Great. And Myron, before we finish, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, maybe how during normal times people could access these volumes at McMaster.
Absolutely. And first, I'm going to talk about not McMaster, because we're in a pandemic and people should have access to texts whether they can come into our library or not. The Encyclopédie, fortunately, has been digitized in its entirety by a number of different sites. When the recording of this talk goes up, I'm going to be sending along some further resources for people that may wish to learn more or to access the text of the Encyclopédie itself. But in a McMaster context, we are proudly open to the public. So in a normal non-plague time, any member of the public would be able to walk in, although we do appreciate the courtesy of advance notice, and say, I'd be really interested in seeing volume 6 of the Encyclopédie. And if you are affiliated with McMaster, you're already all set because you have a library card. If you're not, there's an additional process where we can set you up with a guest borrower account that basically conveys the same privileges that a McMaster person would have. Why is that, you ask? Well, it's because we don't check anything out of the rare book library. You can't take any of it home with you, which means that you have the same privileges as anybody else. That is to say, you can look at it in the reading room, then you leave, and it's here for you next time you come in. Anyone can come in and see these volumes. They do need to be handled with care. We can provide support and guidance around this, around matters of handling and whatnot. But gosh, it's been a while since I've had to tell people we are physically located at the lower level of Mills Memorial Library. And so anyone can come and check these out anytime that we're open.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Myron. So that sort of brings us to the end of our time today. Once again, thank you to Myron and Dr. Grodek for your generosity with this session. And thank you also to all of the attendees. We hope you enjoyed this. This presentation was recorded and it will be available in about a week with captions on the McMaster UTV channel on YouTube or on the Alumni Archived Talks webpage. Finally, you'll see a survey pop up when this webinar ends. Your responses are super helpful and we do appreciate the feedback. But for now, thank you once again for tuning in and enjoy the long weekend.